Hello and welcome to the Brazilian BA Guests. We are transmitting this on LinkedIn, on my channel on LinkedIn, and on my channel on YouTube as the Brazilian BA. If you're not subscribed yet, subscribe to this channel, clicking on the bell, and be advised whenever we have a new video. I have a guest today to talk about product backlog, and my guest is Mr. Michael White. Hello, Michael. Thank you for coming.
Hi, Fabricio. It's a pleasure to be here today.
Oh, the pleasure is all mine. I have a good question to start a conversation today. And my question is how to avoid product backlog overload. I thought you could start by saying about product backlog and overload, do some definitions, and so we can talk about how to avoid it later. What do you think about that?
Yeah, that sounds good. Product backlog in general is something that can be hard to manage for a lot of people in Agile and business analysis. But, one of the things that I would typically recommend for people trying to manage backlogs is to, first off, have a clear vision, right? Understanding what the objectives are for the project. And so this typically comes in the form of a business case, or in many Agile environments, you might have something like a vision or vision statement that drives the objectives and the goals for the project. So, typically when you have that to start, that's kind of like the North Star, right? Where the organization wants to go. But it also serves as a nice filter every time you have new items that come up in the backlog, as well as anything that needs to be changed. You can kind of make sure that it's aligning with the things that you all have in that vision. So it's a really nice, I guess, kind of like, again, like I said, like a filtering or reference tool to kind of keep everything aligned. And I found that a lot of teams that are in Agile or managing backlogs, when they don't have that vision statement or a business case or anything like that to reference, they kind of flounder at the beginning because they're not quite sure what the goals are. So you start seeing things in the backlog that maybe shouldn't be there or aren't adding the most value that they could, right? So I would start there.
This vision or these, let's say, strategic goals are also part of the backlog, aren't there?
Typically you don't see them. It might be something that you might post as a team or keep it, visually. Usually in the backlog, you might see like your epics or, your features and things like that. The objectives are things like, what we're trying to do. We're trying to increase customer satisfaction. We're trying to decrease this. We want to be the, premier, financial institution, whatever those goals are that the organization is essentially trying to achieve. So every organization works different. Typically they might be mixed in with themes. Some organizations use themes in their backlog, but a lot of the times you don't necessarily see it in the backlog as like a backlog item.
Right, because there's also the risk of people getting an overload of objectives.
Yeah,
And so if that's an strategic stuff, you should be taking some decisions about being strategic, is saying what you're not doing. So
exactly.
deciding what's the most important thing to do, what are we focusing on, at least on the next year, next semester, or something, having some
Yeah,
commitments.
exactly. And that leads into my next point, is spending more time on pre-iteration activities, right? So these are the things like defining the team charter, which is a little bit different from like a project charter. But, the team charter is, one, going over the goals and objectives, and two, kind of formulating the team, how we're going to work together. What are some of our backlog processes, right? Creating specifications around the various types of backlog items. Most of us are familiar with stories, but how are we going to structure our acceptance criteria? How are tasks going to be involved? How are we going to document non-functional requirements, right? That's another area where people tend to struggle, right? And so having these types of decisions made prior to the iteration starting allows the team to just get started and kind of flow, right? Without starting and being stagnant, because these decisions aren't made. There's no clarity, there's no transparency. When you spend, a couple weeks having those pre-iteration activities, it allows for much more effective backlog management, as well as much more effective sprints or iterations as well. So I think if I could say, like, one of the things that many organizations should spend more time doing is refining their pre-iteration activities. That way, when the sprint actually starts, the team can just hit the ball rolling and be much more effective working together.
It sounds like a lot of the overflow we have in the backlog, by what you're saying, is related to a bad structure in the way we are managing our backlog. So if your backlog is just a bag where you just throw in every desire of your customers, of your users, or everything that people are saying, oh, there's a bug over here, and you just throw everything together, the
Yeah,
chance to get an overload is too high. So we
absolutely.
should organize our backlog and give us some tips on how is a good backlog organized.
Yeah, I think, again, every organization is a little bit different. One, like I mentioned, you want to have whatever your vision, whatever document or platform that contains your goal, that should be something that the team continuously sees, right? Again, if it's a vision statement, have that available. If you're using the product backlog, the product roadmap as your source of the goals, then make that visible to the team. So there should be always something visual that the team can see. And then, get agreement on how we're going to structure the backlog. Are we going to use epics, and then are we going to use features? Are we going to break the epics down into features? Or are we going to go from epics directly to the stories, right? So these are decisions that need to be made prior in order to get things flowing, right? And then there is the structure of the items themselves. So if we're dealing with stories, who's going to manage the stories? Is it going to be the business analyst? Is it going to be the product owner? And also, how are we going to structure our acceptance criteria, right? That's one of the major issues around product backlog overload, right? One, the developers not understanding the structure, or two, maybe the person who's writing the acceptance criteria, maybe they're not putting enough in, maybe they're not structuring it consistently. So having a standard or a structure around the acceptance criteria is a major best practice for managing that type of overload, right? Because that's going to allow the developers to know, one, when the story's done, two, what the outcome should look like, right? They'll know how to test it if you have a really good and clear set of acceptance criteria, right? And also coming up to agreements around other types of backlog items, right? Tasks, right? How are the developers going to add that? Are they going to associate it with a particular story? Also, spikes and research items. Are these going to be things that we need to account for in our velocity, or are these things that are going to be visible in the backlog as well, right? We need to know these types of things ahead of time so that when they come up, they're not serving as these roadblocks, right? These are things that we can anticipate ahead of time, so that when they come up, we know what they are, we recognize them, but then we move on, right? So there are a lot of different things that we should be having these agreements on. And then also, the definition concepts, right? The clear definition of ready, the clear definition of done, right? Even the definition of delivery, right? And that goes a little bit beyond just the IT work, these are some things that, you know, we're ready to deliver, but they might require some outside resources like marketing or training or things like that. So having clarity, I think, you know, in that first 2 weeks prior to the sprint can really be beneficial for the team. I think another thing too is having kind of boundaries around who can manage the backlog, right? We don't want everyone on the team just adding items, right? We should have everything should maybe funnel through the business analyst, or everything should funnel through the product owner, unless it's something technical where the developers are adding things, but that goes outside of prioritization, so we don't worry about that. But in terms of the things that are going to be impacted by priority, we want to have a tight boundary around who can add items, who can modify items, and things like that. That way there's clarity and there's transparency as well.
In the first time you answered, you mentioned something that got my attention, that was about functional, non-functional requirements.
Yes.
And usually there is a lot of doubt on that.
Mm-hmm.
And it sounds for me sometimes that when we are dealing with a product backlog, we're dealing with ethics and stories, as you said, trying to connect those with goals that are in a product roadmap. And there are requirements related to functional and non-functional requirements with business rules. And the connection between stories and requirements is not sometimes so clear. Like if stories were not requirements, but they are. And they can be talking about different types of requirements simultaneously. To understand a story, we may have different types of requirements in the same story. We may need to build something in the system that's a functionality, a functional requirements, something that the system must do, and the system must be able to deal with a certain number of user or requests, and that's a non-functional requirement in different channels or something like that. And to take some decisions, this functionality may be based on some business rules. And so this description of rules, functional requirements and non-functional requirements, sometimes seems less what the developers must do and more like what the system must do, or the solution must take care in a continuous way and can improve. It could be reevaluated or versioned during time. So those are different types of informations. And that sometimes I feel like brings some kind of overload when people are rewriting stories to change a functional requirement that already exists in the past, but they're just trying to bring some new characteristic. Let's say there's a report and they just want to add an additional data over there. How can people deal with that to avoid this overload and try to bring some consistency and structure for their backlog?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think, again, having a plan and having that transparency. A lot of the times, we talked about a few things. So I'm going to start with the non-functional, because I think that's an area that a lot of people have issues with. So the team definitely needs to come to an agreement on how they're going to be documenting non-functional requirements. I've seen it work several different ways. You know, a lot of the times the non-functional requirements is not just for a specific function, it's for the system as a whole. So sometimes it might be a good idea to make the decision to just have one giant story with the non-functional requirements, or you can have a whole story itself just committed to the non-functional requirement itself, right? I've also seen it where the non-functional requirements are kind of specified out in the definition of done, right? So I think it really depends on the types of non-functional requirements that are related to what you're building. But again, it all goes towards consistency and transparency and getting agreement with the team that this is how we're going to handle these non-functional requirements. Same thing with, you know, reporting requirements and things like that. Do we want to just have a separate story and label it, these are reporting stories, and then we can outline those specifications there. These are the business rule stories, and then outline the specifications there. So I think, using whatever tool you're using, if it's Jira, TFS, or whatever, being familiar with the functionality, the labeling of that. But again, it's something the team has to commit to, and have that transparency, right? But also, if you have that funnel where it is limited to who has the ability to create the stories, right? So if it is just the BA and the product owner, those two participants need to work together to stick to that model and also communicate that out to the team, right? These are the reporting requirements. These are the non-functional requirements. So this is what you can expect. Because a lot of the times those roadblocks that we're seeing with backlogs not moving along is people are really just confused. They're sitting there, they're floundering. And, a lot of that could be prevented with just having a game plan.
Okay. I believe that people who may watch this episode and listen us to talk about product backlog may have different levels of maturity in their organizations dealing with backlog.
Yes.
Some organizations are really refining their backlog in the way that we are mentioning, and for some other organizations, maybe they're just dealing with the problem that people don't even respect the backlog.
Yes.
So when you are in the middle of a project, people are not doing what is specified on the backlog. They're just doing what the user is telling them to do in the exact moment. So even those sprints or iterations are not delivering what they are supposed to do because people don't respect the backlog. So for those who are in that situation, what's your recommendation? It's not just an overflow problem in the backlog, it's an overflow everywhere. Right?
Yeah. I think their communication becomes really, really key, right? One, you want to first identify that, the backlog isn't being respected and define what that means, right? If it's people aren't, practicing what we call proper backlog hygiene, where they're not changing the statuses, or they're not, we're getting duplicate stories or duplicate backlog items. We need to identify that and bring it forth, have that open communication, whether it's during stand-ups or if it's during the, the retrospectives. We need to be comfortable raising these items, right? And also not just raising the items, but also being able to articulate the impact of the product backlog not being respected, or the process not being followed, right? And I'm also a big advocate of, whenever I raise an issue, I like to follow up with some type of resolution as well, so that it's not like I'm complaining. It is, trying to resolve an actual problem, right? So you definitely want to be able to, articulate the impact of those things, as well as come up with a recommendation on how to move forward. So being very intentional during the times that we do have structured environments, such as during the stand-ups, the retrospectives, even if during a review session, if time permits, you can kind of talk about how we can do some of these things a little more effectively. But again, I think a lot of that comes with the team at the very beginning, coming when I mentioned that team charter way ahead, the team respecting one another and allowing that open feedback, and allowing for safety. People should feel comfortable being able to raise issues as soon as they happen, so that we can resolve them as quickly as possible. Because sometimes people don't realize the impact of not respecting the backlog, right? So again, I think being able to articulate that might build some empathy on their end to say, okay, well, I didn't realize that by me not doing this, that will cause this issue, right? So there, I think communication becomes really, really important.
I like the definition of the team charter that you mentioned.
Yes.
And it would solve a lot of problems if we spend some time before starting to have a predefined method or methodology where we are working on. And it's not just about the backlog items, it's about who is responsible for putting things on the backlog, for prioritizing the backlog, for defining the structure of the backlog, as you said. So
Yeah.
if we could have this very well structured from the beginning, life would be so easier. And I think you gave us a very interesting tip. If you don't have this from the beginning, use your retrospectives to do that. Use your stand-up meeting. You should have create times. If you don't have it, if your method is not even respecting retrospectives, let's say, you should create times for open conversation to discuss not just the requirements of your product or of your project, but your method of working. That's the important thing you're bringing.
Absolutely. Yeah. And another thing I didn't really get to mention is the importance of having a clear refinement process, right? You definitely want to have a clear refinement process prior to, or grooming, depending on what your team calls it, prior to the iteration planning or the sprint planning, right? Because you want to have the opportunity for the developers to ask their questions, right? This is also where a lot of the design questions are going to be asked, right? And so this is important because one, you're getting feedback from the development team, and you should be able to articulate to them, what it's supposed to be. And that's going to let you know whether or not your format of acceptance criteria is clear or not, right? So you're getting feedback even during these refinement or grooming sessions as well. So really, any time that you are communicating with development or the product team, it should be a way for you to get some type of feedback to let you know whether or not the method you're taking or the approach you're taking is optimal for that particular project, because we all know that every project is different, right? So just being really open to receiving that feedback and making accommodations or adjustments to act on that feedback is really important when it comes to managing that backlog.
I want to come back to this idea of developing your requirements in your stories. But before going into this detail, let me bring you some question here from, I'm not sure if I will mention his name correctly, Mania. Do you mean we do not need to create a user story for non-functional requirements when you're explaining the approach, all those different approaches for non-functional requirements? Could you make it more clear what options may be available?
Yeah. So yes. So there's several different ways to document non-functional requirements. So like I mentioned, some people who might not be as familiar with the concept, they think, oh, there's a non-functional requirement for every functional requirement. And it's really not a one-to-one situation. You might have 5 non-functional requirements and like 100 functional requirements, right? So because the non-functional requirements don't always directly relate to an individual functional requirement, which is a user story and the acceptance criteria, right? Sometimes you might just have one entire story or backlog item that lists out the various non-functional requirements, almost like a checklist of non-functional requirements. Or you can, so that's one way to have like maybe one backlog item that represents all of the non-functional requirements, or depending on the size and the amount of effort it takes to execute that non-functional requirement, you can just have a backlog item for some of the larger non-functional requirements individually, and then maybe you compare some of the smaller non-functional items, into group them into one story or backlog item, right? So you want it's the use of user story. They're technically not user stories, but they are stories. They might just be called backlog items, and you might label them something different. So they don't necessarily need to be in the form of a user story. Now, sometimes you can address non-functional requirements in the form of acceptance criteria as well. So for example, if a non-functional requirement is around performance or timing or response time, in your acceptance criteria, you can say something like, given this, when I do that, the system does this within 30 seconds or something like that. So addressing your non-functional requirements within acceptance criteria is another approach. So there's various ways to document the non-functional requirements in a backlog. I think one, it depends on what works best for the team, and two, how related those non-functional requirements are to the actual functional requirements, right? Which are the stories and the acceptance criteria. So just as long as they're documented somewhere, but there's no right or wrong way. Like I said, I've seen it work in various ways. Again, another way that I've seen it is documenting it out in the form of, the rules of the definition of done, checking when you're validating that it's done, making sure that those non-functional requirements are accounted for as well. So I think the most important thing is the transparency of it. So whatever the team agrees on, as long as it's out there so that everybody knows what to do and how to approach, one, how to document those non-functional requirements and where to document them.
I can share a little bit of my experience on that, and I like it very much the way you presented the non-functional requirements as a checklist. I always try to think about them as a checklist that should be checked, especially those functional requirements that covers the whole bunch of functional requirements. For example, let's say that I have a non-functional requirement saying that my system should work on Google Chrome, right? Version 10. And that's a non-functional requirement. Whatever new functionality I create or whatever user's story that I create must be tested against these specifications. So this is a checklist. So it should work on Google Chrome. It should have a time of response no more than 10 seconds. It should be, how do you say, when we just change your phone from one perspective to another,
yeah.
So it should be adaptable. There's a beautiful word for that, right? It should be in English and Portuguese. It should. Those items are a very good checklist that you should check for every functionality you create.
Yes.
And they are not really very, in my experience, well created in the backlog, because every time you create a new user story, you will run through that checklist all over again. So if it's a user story and this user story was done in the past, it doesn't mean it's going to be done for new user stories. So probably some kind of document, then there's a lot of different approaches, as you said, but something that you come back and recheck and test it again for every new functionality is very useful for non-functional requirements. That's my experience.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, again, it goes to transparency and communication, right? Having the team, these are the general types of non-functional requirements. We got usability, we've got performance, localization. So like you were saying with the language and things like that, these are the things that we want to make sure that we're considering, right? And then we can get into based on how this team operates, because every agile team is different working together. How do we think we want to document this in the most effective way based on the type of product that we're trying to build?
Okay. Let me come back to the detailing of the requirements. So I have a user story, and user stories could be described in very different levels of abstraction.
Yes.
And so you mentioned the importance of having a grooming session or something that we can detail those requirements. Can't I have the problem of having very detailed user stories in a level that's very specific for implementation, and so I have an overload of my backlog, and it's almost difficult to manage and prioritize because there's so much requirements. But if you look for them, they're really small, and my user stories are so detailed and like written by a programmer and not by a user in itself.
Yeah. Yeah, I think again that goes into, and sometimes it's important to have that formal training. If you feel like a team is, or an organization is not documenting requirements in a way that's effective, sometimes getting formal training on these types of things is really needed, right? Because user stories are exactly that. They're user stories. A user should be able to read the story and then see, okay, this is the flow. Once I do this, this should happen, right? Because it's always supposed to be from the user perspective. We're not looking at, as a developer and blah, 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 like those, or as a system, those are not really user stories in terms of best practice, right? So having clarity around what the user story is supposed to be and when, right? So again, you should gain agreement on going through those cycles of priority and estimating, right? So, we might start off with a list of um, epics that gives us a high level overview of the scope of the project, right? Gain an agreement with the product owner. So is this the real scope of the product? Is this really at a high level everything we need, right? Getting that agreement, right? And then, having a high level priority of that. This epic is big, this epic is medium, this epic is small, right? So that high level priority. And then, or sizing, how, whichever one is significant at that time. And then going into that gradual decomposition process, right? So at the right time, prior to the next iteration, we see, okay, these are the epics that need to get broken down into the stories, or these are the stories we're going to bring forward. At this point, they're just stories. And so sometimes, that's where you would want to go through that exercise of decomposing that story into the detailed acceptance criteria. For me, I always default to the Gherkin format because I feel like that's a very user friendly format. Also, another, if you're dealing with a lot of data, using the checklist format. And I think having awareness of the proper structures around those, and when it's better to use this type of format or that type of format, can be really helpful as well, right? Because one, a user story, the first person that's supposed to do the acceptance for the user story is the product owner. So the product owner is supposed to be able to say, okay, this is the story, these are the steps, this is what I know is done, and then yes, this is my acceptance. The developer, well, actually, that's a little bit backwards. The developer is first supposed to be able to go through the flow and say, okay, this is what I'm building and this is what I'm coding, but the acceptance criteria should be laid out in a way that allows them to say, yes, what I have built is correct. Now let me give this to the product owner to do the initial acceptance, right? And then, they'll say, okay, yeah, it looks good. Now we can give it to QA and then we can take it to UAT, right? So I think understanding the level of, knowing that it's supposed to be human, acceptance criteria is typically supposed to be human readable, right? In humanistic language. So I think that's an important element that often gets missed, right? I mean, there are things that you might need to add, like calculations and things like that, where you might need to add that into a story if appropriate, right? If it is a calculation. But this also is where we start looking at supplemental documentation, right? Not everything has to be a story, right? If something requires data mapping or calculations, we can attach more detailed documentation to that story so that the developer can reference. We can attach a use case. We can attach a wireframe. That's what supplemental documentation is for, to enhance the understanding of that user story. So every user story might not require that minute level of detail, but if it does, we can use that supplemental documentation to support that story.
It's interesting when you think about all the details that are available and how sometimes programmers start doing business analysis job and they try to codify communication as they do with computers. And we should not do that. We are not dealing with machines. We're dealing with people. And even with machines, we are more and more dealing with AI, which talks the same communication as we do. So
Right.
if you're writing for good people to understand, that's probably the best approach.
Yeah. Yeah. And that it's sometimes, we do come across that where we have, like you said, the developers trying to do BA work where they're writing these stories, or it might be a task that gets misassigned. And so that's where we come in as the BAs to say, hey, can we get this, and or maybe we can translate it into something that the product owner can actually verify, right,
Mhm.
prior to approving it into the iteration, right? So again, I think that's where the team forming dynamic kind of comes into place. Okay, we don't want developers doing this because of XYZ, but if a developer does this, funnel it through the BA so that we can reorganize it and structure it in a way that the product owner can actually understand and actually verify, right? So I think a lot of the times, again, there's always so many different types of people that have their own experience and their own background and their own practices. So this is why we need to come together early on and say, hey, this is what I'm used to, whatever, and then come to an agreement as to what works. And in addition, having that open feedback to when we're identifying things that's not working for this team, we need to be able to pivot to do something different.
Perfect. There are some situations where the backlog gets too big. And even if they are written, let's say, in the correct form, but you may have product backlogs with 4,000 items or 4,000 user stories over there. And you see that some of those stories are there for 2 years and nobody takes care of that.
Yeah,
And when you start reading of those, you don't even know if they are still valid user stories or
yeah.
not. Uh, for those people who are in these situations, what are your recommendations?
Yeah, again, I think that's where having that clear vision helps, right? Because if you're seeing you've got a big list of stories and nobody's doing anything with them, chances are if you go back to that vision or go back to your goals and objectives, that story might not even really be something that's in alignment with that goal. This story might not even really be helping achieve that goal, right? So this goes back to using your vision statement or your business case as a filter, right? So if we've got all these things, we're going to you know align these up to this vision and see if these stories are actually going to be supporting our goals and objectives. If they're not, we can automatically get rid of them because they're not really really within scope anyway. So let's just get rid of those. And we do know that Agile does leave room for flexibility. So I do want to leave space for that as well, for potential, enhancements down the line and things like that. So I think that also goes into planning as well, having a structured process for um, future items and enhancement requests down the line and things like that. So there is a place for that, but when it gets so big, we have to go back to that original vision statement and seeing if these stories are still even aligned with what we originally intended. And if not, you can just get rid of them.
Okay. Carnival J is asking, isn't that what backlog grooming is for? And he compliments, led by the product owner.
I would say that backlog grooming is actually to make sure that everyone is really clear on what the story is asking for. The backlog grooming should be a way to make sure that the developer has time to discuss some of the design details, making sure that we've articulated the acceptance criteria enough so that the developers are able to estimate or size the story appropriately, right? So backlog grooming to me is more of a we're not always going back to the goals at that point. We're making sure that the backlog items are clear, that they're structured, and that they're ready to be worked on. When you leave a backlog grooming session, you should have a list of stories that are ready to be worked on by the developers with very little need for additional questions and things like that. So those types of things should be handled during those grooming sessions.
Right. And so the grooming session would not have all the backlog, but the backlog that we are supposed to talk. I like the definition of a story as an invitation to a chat. So when I'm writing a user story, I'm not writing a full specification of my requirements with everything you need to know about that. It's just a card that invites us for a very good chat, and I can explain you more. And if we think that this story worth it is worth to be developed, we can create additional documentation on that, and we can specify it better in the appropriate moment.
Yeah. And another thing that I did mention earlier when we talked about backlog grooming or refinement is, it's also a tool to prepare the items for the planning session, right? Because when you have your iteration planning, the team's coming together to say, okay, these are the stories, this is our velocity, this is what's going to go in the upcoming sprint or iteration. You want to have well understood stories because decisions are going to be made at this planning session, right? And so you don't want to spend the planning session asking questions of clarification about the backlog items, right? You want to go into the planning session with a clear set of stories. That way, the decisions made can be well informed.
Right. So for the planning session, I should have a list of requirements that we understood, that we in some way measured or estimated, so we can make our planning session work and not have to lose or spend the time of that planning session making an estimation or understanding. There's another question here, and thanks for asking, Carnival J. It's a pleasure to have questions here. How is what you described it about a grooming backlog different from refinement?
Backlog, grooming, and refinement are interchangeable to me. Usually a backlog grooming session and a backlog refinement session are the same. Well, and let me say it like this.
He says it may be a terminology issue.
Yeah.
Usually they use different terms, but maybe the same different.
I'll rephrase it. Actually, backlog refinement is a broader umbrella term. So backlog refinement might include grooming, it might include prioritization and other things, right? Grooming is a little more specific to making sure their stories are good, but backlog refinement is a little bit of a broader term that might incorporate some additional things that are maybe outside of just grooming itself. So maybe that can help Carnival J.
Perfect. Yeah, and terminology is always an issue when we are talking about those stuff because people use. I see very often people use terminology differently, but I like when we have some good definitions and can clarify those definitions. It makes our conversation better. There's another question here. Who else other than a product owner assists a business analyst in backlog grooming?
Yeah, I think it really depends on the organization. Usually, when you're saying grooming, at the grooming session, you would have, maybe the product owner, the BA, and the developers, because the developers are the ones we want to make sure that the developers can understand the stories. So the developers are the ones who are asking the questions of clarification, because they need all the information they can so that they can think about the design aspects of the story itself, because a lot of the design aspects of a backlog happens at the grooming session. So they want to make sure that they understand the work that they need, the technical work that they need to do. They also want to be able to say whether or not it's big or small or medium, or give it whatever score or pointing size they want to do it. So to answer your question, the developers are really the ones that are assisting us make sure that what we have is refined enough for them to understand. So I feel like if they're still asking questions, that's additional refinement work that I need to do as the BA or the product owner. Or if, that'll give them time to say like, okay, this seems like it might be a lot of work. this might be too big for one story. We might need to split it, right? So that's also things that we're doing during those refinement sessions as well, right? So I think outside of the product owner, the developers definitely need to be there because they're the audience at that point. The backlog is for them to work on.
Right. And when you say developers, this is also a term that can be ambiguous and can involve different types of experts. Everyone who is related to developing could be part of this. I have seen that usually quality assurance analysts or testers are very good in helping to understand different aspects and to define criteria about is this user story the same that the other one, because they have this vision about how they are going to test it at the end, and they help to understand the requirements very well.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I'm glad that you mentioned QA because I do like to have QA in there as well, because QA is very good at helping me make sure that my acceptance criteria is testable, right? Because they should be able to take the acceptance criteria that I create as the BA and then expand upon those acceptance criteria into full-blown test cases, right? So yes, you would definitely want to have QA there as well, because they want to make sure that because you want to make sure as the BA that your acceptance criteria is testable.
Right. So Carnival J thanked us. Thanks for answers. I'm also a BA, which is why I'm interested and curious. Welcome, Carnival. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Yeah. So let's say that people are looking for more information about that, about this terminology. You mentioned a lot of stuff that while you were presenting that I didn't interrupt you because I gave those or I took those concepts as known by everyone, but I know that they are not. Like you mentioned spikes, you mentioned retrospectives, you mentioned planning, you mentioned a lot of different concepts that people might need to know better or wanting to learn more about that. And what do you suggest for people who want to get more information on dealing with their product backlogs, and especially with all those concepts that they have to engage and become more familiar with this vocabulary?
Yeah, I think, the Agile Alliance is a really good source of, I don't want to say source of truth, but it's like one of the, bodies around Agile. I think they're really good. A really good resource around, understanding those general terms and things like that. So I would start there. I think any book you can get on Agile or Agile terminology is really good. I talk a lot about it on my website. A lot of different terminologies in general, not just Agile terminologies, but business analysis terminology. So I think being intentional about wanting to understand that stuff, things will just start appearing to you, right? But if I were to say as a starting point, I would definitely say the Agile Alliance website is a good place to start.
Perfect. And how about you, Michael? I know that you mentioned your website have some information, and let's use these final moments just to talk a little bit about what can people find into your website. What is the address? Where can people find more information about you?
Yeah, thank you for that.
This is your space for commercial, right?
Yeah, my commercial space. Well, you can definitely learn more about me at thebadoc.com. So that's THEBADOC.com. I have several articles about business analysis. I have a glossary of terms there, quotes, all these fun things about business analysis. And you can definitely learn more about the courses that I offer, business analysis training, IIBA certification, as well as one-on-one coaching as well. So I don't want to say it's a one-stop shop, but it's definitely a good resource for business analysts who want to, expand on their career trajectory. So you can always, you can follow me on LinkedIn at the Business Analysis Doctor, also YouTube, wherever social medias, I typically have the same handle, either the business analysis doctor or the BA doc. But yeah, I'm wherever you look for me, I'll be there.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. Just not to end this session losing some stuff. Is there any important ingredient for a backlog management that we didn't mention, and you think it's important for us to say today?
Yeah, I think we did cover this, but I think more organizations do need to spend more time on those pre-iteration activities, right? So, I coach or train a lot of people who have never even heard of a team charter, right? So those types of iteration preparation activities are so important for setting up the team for success and setting up those iterations for success, because you don't want to try to figure it all out as you go, because it just leads to roadblocks. So you can make everybody's job just a little bit easier by spending that first couple of weeks forming the team, coming up with the agreements, defining the processes, getting everybody on the same page. I would say that would be the number one thing, is that defining that team charter and everyone getting in alignment with what the roles are, what the responsibilities are, what the process is.
Right. And I guess that a lot of people may feel like disappointed that, oh, we should have done this before. Probably they should, but there is still time. So stop and think about your team. You're not just building a product, you're also building a team that must work together. And so
Right.
dedicate some time for building your way of working. Is that correct? Did I got it right?
Absolutely. It's agile is product based and process based. It's not all about the product build. You have to have a clearly defined process in order for it to work. And the problem is, a lot of people think agile, oh, it's quick, we don't need documentation, but there is still a structure and a standard that you should have to make it effective, right? So you definitely don't want to lose that.
Perfect. And there's some thanks here. Thank you for these insights about Agile product backlog.
Yeah, you're
We
very
are also thanking as well. So thank you guys for watching and for following us and bringing your questions and comments. It was a pleasure to have you guys here. And it was a pleasure to have you, Michael. It's a so enlightening session. I learned a lot. Very useful. I will end this session right now, but I ask you to stay a little longer after I close, so we can chat a little bit after the session.
Sounds like fun. Thank you for having me.
Oh, it was my pleasure. So bye-bye for everyone else. See you in the next episode.
Bye.